To install MOST on the copy machine, I'm going to use the MFP Control Center, which is again under the MOST shortcuts that are installed, and it's labeled Installed to MFPs. So let's minimize some of this. Now, I'm going to use the Control Center because in my case it's the most convenient, but there are really 3 different ways we can install MOST to an MFP. Depending on the manufacturer, the methods are slightly different. But I'm going to be installing to a Ricoh device for today's training, I guess, or tutorial. And with the Ricoh device, there's 3 methods. One is the Control Center, which we'll be using now. The second is using the MFP's website or web image monitor. We can manually upload a zip file to install MOST. And then the last method is if we walk up to the machine, we can actually type in a URL that connects to the server and downloads MOST. So in any of those methods, the first step is to go into the Control Center and configure the settings. And the reason we do that is because it will actually update the zip file that's used for the other 2 methods, whether it's uploading manually or downloading using a URL from the machine. Both of those methods use a zip file that gets downloaded to the machine, and it needs to be pre-configured before that can be done. So here on the menu, I'm going to go to editing the Ricoh settings, since that's the device I'll be using. Oh, okay. I see there's a question on the side there. Toshiba devices at the moment are not supported. To be honest, I don't know if that's something in the works or not. You're welcome. So now that we're in the Ricoh settings, we could either go through them manually or use the wizard option in the bottom left corner. The wizard tends to be the most straightforward approach for the majority of scenarios, and I tend to prefer going that method, but we'll kind of step through both quickly. As we step through the wizard, the Control Center will automatically populate the IP address and port based on your server's configuration. It doesn't hurt to double check it, but in my case, they're already pre-populated correctly. The next setting available is a login window image address. Essentially, we can choose an image to use at the login screen of MOST. So if I log out on MOST Desktop, you'll see above the credentials that are entered, there's a Reform logo. We can replace that with any custom logo that you select at this step of the Control Center settings. Now, offhand, I don't recall the requirements of the dimensions and colors, but that is documented in the MOST manual. The next setting available is Copy Counter, and that's closely related to the Tracker plugin that Reform offers. Since we don't have Tracker installed on here today, I'm going to leave this to false, but I'll explain a little bit of what this does. And essentially, it allows us to track the copies that are made at the MFP. So the scenario would be the user walks up to the machine. If they haven't authenticated yet, they won't be permitted to make a copy. Once they log in using their domain credentials, they can be either granted an unlimited amount of copying or a specific balance, let's say. They can then proceed to make their copies as usual using the built-in copy functionality of the device. And when they're done, they'll log out of MOST. At that point, the information on the user's activity is then sent up to the server and tracked using the Tracker website and reports. And that's essentially what this option would toggle, is to turn on the copy tracking abilities. The last setting it's prompting for is the MFP password. And this is required for, I think, any device or any manufacturer that I can think of. Essentially, we need to be able to log into the machine to install the software. So usually it's the same password that you would enter to log into the device's website. So I'm going to enter the password we have here and hit finish. Just looking over the other settings. I think the timeout settings might be something interesting to some people. Basically, if you're using the scan preview at the device or the continue option at the device that allows you to add additional pages after each batch of pages that you scan, they have a timeout on them, so that if the user walks away and forgets about it or doesn't realize that it's going to prompt them for them to continue or not, it'll automatically finish the job after 30 seconds of inactivity, so the user doesn't lose their scan. If the time needs to be increased or the default action needs to be changed to cancel instead of finish, that can be done at this screen. 30 seconds seems to be a pretty good average time, but I do know some customers that do larger batches, maybe hundreds of pages, they'll walk away, and 30 seconds isn't long enough for them to realize that their large batch has finished before the screen finishes for them. So it is something that once in a while would need to be adjusted based on the user's experience. Here again, under device, there's function locking and copy tracking, which would require the tracker or tracking plugin with Reform. We have the MFP password that we entered. And there's an option for additional card reader models, which typically doesn't need to be turned on, but I guess it does remind me that I should mention proximity cards or card readers that are available with the machines. So many of the machines support a card reader that plugs into the USB port on the back of the machine. And what that allows us to do is the user would walk up to the machine. Let's say they've never swiped their card before. They can swipe their card, and most on the MFP will then prompt them for their credentials. It'll say username and password, just like the login screen would. And they enter their information. If that information is correct, most will link that card to their credentials. So anytime that card is scanned again, whether it's at that machine or at a different machine, they won't be prompted for their credentials again. It'll just automatically log them in. I guess there are two things to mention regarding prox cards. One is if the user's password changes and they go to swipe their card, it will inform them that the password is no longer valid and they'll have to re-enter it. So depending on their password policies, they may need to re-enter it periodically. But the card is typically, even in those cases, much more efficient than manually entering the password repeatedly. The other thing to mention is the card readers, for the best user experience, should be configured the same for all the devices. That way, the same information is being read from the card each time they scan. And then we have an advanced tab, which allows us to retrieve information from the SNMP server on the machine. And typically, we don't need to enable this. The options specified in here, if we were to enable it, are to monitor the machine for paper jams or out-of-toner messages so that alerts could be sent, but I don't think we'll be covering that today. So now that I have these settings saved, or I'm about to save them, we should be ready to deploy to the machine. And let me see if the machine is still there. Good. So hopefully everybody can see the the camera I have up here. And the machine is actually in the other room, so if I do go over to it, it may take me a second to kind of run back and forth, but hopefully this will give a good idea of what to expect. So you can see as I start scanning it, the machine wakes up and the screen is actually coming on here. Okay, and the control center has correctly determined that MOST is not installed on this device yet. So I'm going to check this device and say install MOST. One of the useful things with the control center is that you can enter a range of IPs or a list of IP addresses, so you can scan them all at once and deploy all at the same time. In my case, I only had one device to deploy to, so it's a little bit simpler. But essentially on the first screen where you enter the IPs, you can enter a range instead of a single IP address. So usually it only takes a few seconds to install MOST. It looks like it's installed and currently starting up. If MOST was already installed and I needed to update it, it may take a little bit longer. And the reason is, to update MOST, what needs to be done is it will actually uninstall MOST, restart the machine. Once the machine is fully up and running again, it'll reinstall MOST with whatever changes you've made. The only time you would need to reinstall MOST is whether the software on the device is being upgraded to a newer version of MOST, or you've had to change a setting in the control center. Because the settings configured in the MFP control center are installed with MOST, those settings would need to be redeployed, while settings made in the MOST designer, like I said earlier, are saved on the server, and those don't require redeployment. So here on the MFP, I'm going to hopefully zoom in on the screen so we take a look. And I'll open MOST Desktop just next to it. So you can see the screens are very similar between the machine and what I have using MOST Desktop. I'm going to log in on MOST Desktop, and I'll run over to that machine quick, logging in as the same account, and what we'll see is the functionality available is actually identical. You'll notice as I enter the credentials, we're using the on-screen keyboard as opposed to MOST, where we can just simply type in using the normal keyboard at my desk. Okay. So what we see here is basically side by side the MFP and MOST Desktop, and you can kind of see they're really showing it exactly the same information.